Yeah. How are you doing? Good, how are you? Hello. How are you? Good. Yes. Well, this like me up. It was just like it sounded just like a fire alarm. That's what it sounds like. You guys haven't heard it yet, but. Oh, I just haven't heard her alarm. It was like. I was like, what the hell? But it was.
Yeah, he
I called Kendra. I was like, what do I do? She was like, just knock on the door. And I did. Nobody answered. So then Kendra came in and knocked on the door.
Probably from high school.
Thank you.
She finished the other half. So.
Have you tried I got it 2 weeks ago, and we were getting emails, but
Yeah, I think
things. So I don't, last time I tried, they might come into me.
Why would I not eat that?
Oh. You can watch me eat them.
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes it's not like this. What do I want to put as the title? I don't want to write it.
I know you're not.
It's only the first two verses. Just messing with No. I don't want to do that. But I don't want to write Pre-Columbian.
Don't write it.
This is a lot of work. Last conversation.
Yeah.
Wow, that actually, that was really good. How was it?
All right, it's now just about 11 o'clock. Before we get underway with the material, just a very brief reminder. So remember at the beginning of the next session, we start off with the third and final quiz of the course. Again, if those people who are in special circumstances, especially of course anyone who for illness can't get come to class, let me know. If I don't hear anything from you, my assumption is that you can physically be here in class, and you will be in class. All right. But if that just, as I said, if for whatever reason you can't come, get in touch with me. There is a Blackboard version, but it's much easier for me just to do in person. All right. Today, as you can see, we're going to be switching geographically, and really to an area that we haven't seen at all before this course. We're actually going to be looking into the Americas today. And you'll notice that probably both of the terms on the title of the outline are a little bit confusing. The first one of these is Pre-Columbian, which refers very simply to any period before Columbus. And specifically, this is important for the Americas, in as much as the Americas will change dramatically after his arrival. So if you study this, you study this very broad period that simply refers to anything before Columbus arrived. Mesoamerica is another term that we don't tend to use much in normal conversation. This is the area we're referring to when we talk about Mesoamerica. It's a term that simply means Middle America. So this point that encompasses parts of modern-day Mexico and parts of Central America. And the reason why this is the area of study is because this is really one of the hot spots for early American development. This is one of the areas which has the best agriculture, and so as a result, we begin to see all sorts of different civilizations popping up in this region, as we'll see today. And, I'm only going to be hitting sort of like three of the most important civilizations in the Americas. Suffice to say that there are plenty of others that we don't either have the time or the historical information to get into. So I'll do as much as I can. And really hit three of the ones that are most important. Much is extremely unclear about the early population of the Americas. As many of you will know, the dominant theory is that there initially was a land bridge in the area that today is known as the Bering Strait. So the area that is between modern-day Siberia and Russia and Alaska. And this is how some of the earliest peoples ended up coming over into the Americas at around 13,000 BC. That is a very a precise date. And we imagine that the reason for the immigration into the Americas was very similar to any of the other sort of movement of peoples that we've seen in this course. People are moving because they're hunting food, they're looking for new opportunities to be able to live. Although we can't really ask the people who did it, so we have no idea really why they thought, but that is the logical conclusion. People have always assumed, again, for the most part, people tend to just walk across this region. I mean, it's possible, of course, that some people chose to take some sort of boats or something to get across the old world into the new. It's just likely, even though, again, we can't really prove that. We can also don't tend to think that the initial population probably was that huge. There are really only so many people who are probably going over to the Americas, which means that what we're going to see is a lightly populated Americas until it begins to go into contact with the old world. We tend to think like other peoples around the world. Some of the earliest Americans simply lived by hunting and gathering. That would make sense. Just as other places, we tend to think early Americans were very good at hunting, especially big game, big mammals. To the point that some of the largest mammals simply, again, will go extinct, probably as a result of overhunting. At this point, then, Americans have to begin to try to find new ways to sustain themselves. We think, just by logic, some of these would have knowledge to be able to fish. Some of them also begin to turn to agriculture in large numbers. And then really, as in other places, it's the turn to agriculture is going to change the Americas forever. We nowadays, especially people who do archaeology, really spend a lot of time, sometimes teeny little particles of pollen and other remains from plants. So we actually have a much better idea of how this process worked. The beginning to do agriculture, beginning to plant and harvest in the Americas. And people are going to learn, for instance, how to cultivate beans, chili peppers, avocado, squash. All of these things become very successful. And it actually is a little bit later on, we think, that eventually people will begin to discover the very important crop of corn, maize, which really ends up becoming by far the dominant crop in the Americas in the early days. And later on, too, people will also begin to cultivate tomatoes. And there are at least some animals that we think were domesticated and eaten. Turkey, for one, less tastefully to our ears, a dog also was eaten. As in other places, with agriculture comes revolution. As people are making more and more money from the ground, this is when we begin to see the first true civilization beginning to rise up in the Americas that we can identify and we can begin to speak about as historians. In many cases, with very similar kinds of features, despite being slightly geographically distinct. all these sort of ceremonial centers involved in small buildings. We think priests, craftsmen, these kinds of things. The first of the major civilizations that people talk about in the Americas, Mesoamerica, is a people known as the Olmec. To give you just how deep our ignorance is of the Olmec, we actually do not know what this civilization referred to itself as. We don't know how what their own name was. And in fact, later people who lived in a similar region, when they referred back to this group, used the term Olmec, which simply refers to the rubber trees that are in the area. The trees, by the way, are not rubber, because I've seen that example test. You use the trees to be able to get rubber, and that's the substance to make rubber. Really, unlike some of these other civilizations we've been studying in this class that historians have been fascinated by for as long as we can remember, the Olmec really, it's not been since the mid-20th century when we really see people begin to seriously investigate this civilization. So, in fact, there may actually be more discoveries in the ground to come. I mean, this is relatively early in the study of this civilization. The reason why we care so much about the Olmec is we think to some degree that they have helped to set a standard that later American civilizations will also draw off of. And they will use some of the same exact sort of things. But it is fair to say that it is extremely frustrating to go through some of the evidence we have for the Olmec because it is so scarce. To give you just some idea of what I mean, we actually have, as you can see here, some statues that are preserved from the Olmec civilization. But the game of trying to interpret what these mean is very difficult. And this fellow, for instance, sometimes is referred to as the wrestler. Because it seems like he appears he has a strong upper body. We have absolutely no idea who this was. This is a god, a human. Your guess is really as good as mine. This guy has an awfully big noggin. But that really is just as deep as the analysis has gone. Was that person special in some way? Possibly. And occasionally you'll get glimpses of people. This appears to be a priest of some kind from some of the Olmec structures, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot about who these people were and what they did in civilization. We see the Olmec setting up shop in Mesoamerica, largely the same reason other peoples go in this area. It's warm, the harvests are good, and they face the very rare problem of peoples in this course in that they had too much rainfall, we think. Part of their job was to try to learn how to run off the water so it didn't absolutely flood their crops, which is a nice problem to have when your problem is trying to get rid of water rather than just to desperately find enough to be able to grow and harvest. In looking at some of the structures that were built, some of these, what appears to be kind of centers for priests or leaders, and looking how elaborate they are, at least some people have said that we don't know the government, but perhaps there was some sort of king or sort of dictator who forced peasants to be able to work on these structures, which at least would make sense, even if we can't really prove it. We do see too that again, as you can see from those statues, in addition to just building what we consider to be some sort of structural or some sort of functional structures, they're also building things just for decoration's sake. The statues are nice, but the ones that we really care about the most, mainly because they're big and cool, are these absolutely enormous human heads that the Olmec would make, which they're really big. To give you some, the tallest of this is 10 feet tall and 20 tons. The question, of course, you all have is, why would you need a head this big in your house or your ceremonial center? And the answer is, we assume what they're trying to do was either glorify their kings or glorify their gods. Maybe their kings were gods. You can see why this is so frustrating to play around with this kind of evidence. Here's another of the absolutely enormous heads that the Olmec would make, that were sculpted from rock. I should say too, much like with the Egyptians I told you earlier, although we have these enormous heads, and they had to get them in place somehow, we don't have any sign that they had any sort of advanced technology to be able to get them in place. We don't even think that the Olmec actually had animal labor that they used. They would just have bunches of large groups of human beings were sort of pushing and pulling these things probably to get them in place. We think that the Olmec tend to spread their influence into areas around them. We think that they probably did some military attacks. They probably also traded to some degree. This, by the way, is from one. This is, by the way, one of the signs. What some people interpret to be something like an altar. It's possible that the Olmec practiced human sacrifice. We don't know that for sure. Later American people definitely did. The Olmec is possible, at least. And again, things like this appear to us like maybe a suggestion that that's what's happening here. So to get back to my earlier point, though, we know that they had some sort of networks of trade set up, because what we actually see at times are masks that are made of jade. And jade does not actually naturally occur in this part of the Americas, meaning that somebody had to go out and get it and trade for it probably. Although we have no idea how those networks work in the least bit. Here's another of those. Uglier looking mask, perhaps. Another thing that we think that they imported, which actually is going to prove to be very important, is this kind of black volcanic stone known as obsidian. And the reason why obsidian is so important to both this and to later Mesoamerican cultures is because you can sharpen it. They did not actually end up developing metal, steel, or iron. But what they do have, it turns out if you know what you're doing with obsidian, you get a large enough block, you can sharpen it to the point that you can use it either to kill people or kill things very easily. So they use obsidian as a weapon of some kind. In addition to the many other problems that we have with the evidence from the Olmec, we really don't know why they go under as a civilization. Some people, it's actually quite interesting that there's no sign that there's ever an invasion from the outside. But yet all of their main structures appear to have gone to a period where they were destroyed, which led some people to hypothesize that there's actually some peasants who got tired of having to do all these sort of work for their overlords. They rebel, they destroy their own structures, and then that's it. That's possible anyway. But again, like many things with the Olmec, we really can't prove that. All right. There are lots of different eras of the Olmec, and in the Americas, we begin to see more and more civilizations that we can pick out and talk about at length. Probably one of the ones that have fascinated people the most in terms of later civilizations are people known as the Maya. Again, to some degree, the story of the Maya is one that's very similar. They too set up in Mesoamerica because of its fertility. The soil was good, and they too, and perhaps even more so than the Olmec, they begin to build up more and more structures. Some of these early structures, I should say, are not, in our sense, they're really not cities, we think. Some of these early centers of Maya were places where important priests and people would live, or places they do ceremonies, but it's not necessarily the places that the majority of the population would live in. And sometimes those are the places that are, they put the most money in, best preserved in the modern world. We think that, again, as with as previous, the Maya had to use a lot of people to be able to build up these cities, to be able to organize labor. And as before too, they harvest corn. They also cultivate cotton for clothing. And perhaps one of the more interesting sort of new crops that the Maya begin to experiment with are these beans known as cacao, which is really a large bean that is primarily interesting to us in the modern world because this is actually the main ingredient of modern chocolate. Although the real limitations of this is that the Maya did not actually didn't know sugarcane. So they would eat this, but it's extremely bitter if you have this bean just by itself. But with that being said, that didn't stop anybody. The Maya loved this stuff. We get some idea that they would just like pop it in their mouth when they could. They would break it up into powder and mix it in water, just have it straight. They would also, we think that the Maya actually didn't, and they never had a currency. So one of the ways to pay for things is to use these beads to be able to trade. So that makes sense as well. Some of these sort of ceremonial centers we have, in time with the Maya, they begin to grow to such a size and complexity that we think the Maya actually do develop honest-to-goodness cities in time, where lots of different people are living, not just the absolute upper class, the priestly class. And we really begin to see all of these plazas with these very high buildings and these kind of stepped pyramids that they begin to build. As with many of these kind of sort of large structures that people would build around the world, part of the reason you build these things is just for sake of glorification, or you're building big buildings. Part of it, though, is probably defensive. Building these high step pyramids actually gives you a good lookout point for the surrounding regions to see if you're being invaded. So it's probably at least part of the reason why the Maya built so many of these kinds of structures. Much like the ancient Greek world, we don't think that the Maya had one big empire or kingdom at any point. What you begin to see instead is all of these kind of small little city kingdoms that were ruled over by these very small-time kings, all of whom have these kind of like fun names like Smoking Frog, Stormy Sky, or my personal favorite, the Great Jaguar Pole. So they have all of these different kings in charge of very small regions, really. Far from being a peaceful coexistence, we think that these small kingdoms were basically constantly at war with one another. These kings were leading expeditions against competing powers. At least one of the ways in which you proved yourself in this society, especially as a man, was that you'd have to go to war constantly, and ideally, not only would you destroy other people's ceremonial centers, but you would also try to take back captives back to your own city. And, there are all sorts of things you could do with captives once you have them. We think that people would publicly humiliate them. Sometimes they would use them as slaves. In other cases, probably more often, they're also sacrificed. So these people they take in battle, they do human sacrifice. So there are many uses that you could have for slaves or even for captives. Needless to say, all of this meant that we don't tend to think that living in Maya society would have been a particularly happy time for most people, because you're living under the constant cloud of warfare. You never knew when these raids from other groups would hit. And so what this meant was that probably even while Maya society was at its height, war was the order of the day. And at some point, we actually begin to think that it may be actually that this kind of internal dissension is going to help to lead to their decline, because it was very difficult to build with the knowledge that everything could be wrecked very quickly by war. Some people have also said that there may be other causes too that lead to the Maya decline. There's some people who really think there may be been an invasion of foreigners as well, which is not entirely clear. And at least other people think that there may have been some sort of natural cause. So some people, for instance, have pointed to they destroyed a lot of forests around them. Some people think it may have been disease or earthquakes as well. Other people just throw up their arms and say it may have been some combination of these many different factors that hit the Maya all at once. But in any case, we do think we see this very striking thing where the Maya cities in one generation were completely filled, and in one generation later, they're empty. And for some reason, basically, the society goes under very quickly. Now, we know a lot more about Maya society than we do with the Olmec, which we're very lucky. One of the reasons why we're able to say a lot more about them in detail. So, for instance, we know that the Maya have an extremely strong priesthood. And there's this very close connection between kings and priests. We also know that the Maya had a lot of respect for merchants. Merchants were actually quite respected, and they were nobles, basically, in this civilization. And it also seems that merchants serve sometimes the role of ambassadors when they go to places to trade outside of Maya cities. And you can see all sorts of goods that they bring in, like rare animal skins, beans, artwork, all these things. But we can also glance at some of the other classes that we know were present in Maya society. Architects and sculptors, for instance, were major jobs. So there were people who were making their living based upon doing this kind of artwork. We also know that there were all sorts of peasants and slaves. I mentioned earlier about often taking the captives who do most of the physical labor. One of the reasons why I'm able to give you even sort of a glimpse then of this hierarchy that existed within the Maya is that we know that Maya priests actually independently discover a form of writing. And again, this is actually one of the few times we can actually say, along with, for instance, the ancient Near East, that this is they had absolutely no contact with anyone from the ancient Near East. So this was just, they independently came up with the idea of writing. In fact, this allowed Maya priests to be able to study astronomy in great detail and math, for instance. We know from what we can decipher that they, for instance, were able to, they knew all about where the planets would travel, they knew when eclipses were going to come, all of these things they studied in great detail. We think that altogether that the Maya had a very sophisticated calendar that is sometimes referred to as the long count. The reason they give this term, they use this term long count, is that the Maya priests very ambitiously, their calendar, their idea about when time starts is at the beginning of time. Then after that, there are these series of cycles that will occur. And one of the reasons why we think the Maya priests spend so much time on really what for us would be astrology, but for them was astronomy, is that much like modern day astronomers, they seem to believe that depending upon what day you were born, there would be specific things that would happen to you, or it would tell something about your character. So it actually was useful in that respect to know those things. They actually do use this dating system in the older monuments, so it clearly was in common currency. They understood it very well. give you some idea of what this kind of writing looks like, I'm running a few examples. Sometimes there's, you don't have to know this class are glyphs. These sort of like these little images that we use to represent writing. This is a system that scholars had seriously started in the 1960s, slowly beginning to decipher the system. In part, by using some of the later languages that we know were developed using a similar language from Maya, they were able to slowly begin to figure out what the Maya glyphs said. And at least one of the reasons why the Maya glyphs were so hard to figure out is very similar, interestingly enough, to hieroglyphs, where some of their symbols are just stand for a sound, like our alphabet. Others stand for this entire word. And again, they're all just set up all together. Even when they first looked at it, there was no what direction they were written in. It was not for anybody. Once we did, though, and again, as people begin to decipher this system of writing now, we're able to do things like not only talk about in astronomy, we have things from the Maya about history and poetry, but their genealogy, their relationships with people with one another, how to administer, all of these things. One of the very frustrating parts to us is that we now, when we have examples of Mayan writing, they're almost always on monuments. What we have, though, is only a small proportion of what once existed. Because, in fact, only things that were inscribed in stone were the things that lasted, whereas we know that the Maya actually initially had books. When Europeans come in contact with the Maya, one of their main goals is to convert people to Christianity. And they feel that any of the old books of the Maya could actually have paganism in them. And so in many cases, what Europeans will do if they get their hands on these books is they completely destroy them. Which is the reason why, in fact, today we really have very few of these things. We'll talk more about this later on in the week, but it is fair to say that from what little we do know about their beliefs, there's some very interesting beliefs that we can tie together with the Maya, like, for instance, the belief that people were created from a mixture of corn and water, which, again, if you really grew up in a region where one of the staple crops is corn, that idea, that myth kind of makes a lot of sense to you, probably. We can also see, too, that the Maya, like many other Mesoamerican people, were highly invested in sacrifice. And there really was this belief, this sort of tit-for-tat belief that if you give the gods blood, human blood, they will provide, in turn, water for you, water for agriculture. So, in fact, if you want the gods to send rain, you almost had no choice but to engage in human sacrifice. Another thing that's very interesting to us about the Maya, although I should really point out that this was not just the Maya. This is something that we see throughout Mesoamerica, but some of our best courts are preserved for the Maya. This is something known as the Mesoamerican ball game. The Mesoamerican ball game, you could play one-on-one, or you can play on teams. What they would have is this rubber ball, you basically had to keep the ball in play. If it went out on you, then the other team gets the point. It was a little bit like soccer in some way, in that you were not supposed to actually touch the ball with your hands. You could only hit it with your feet and other body parts. In a way that I don't entirely understand, that no one's really been able to explain to me too, high up on the courts, there were also these hoops that somehow, I guess if you were really good at this, you could actually kick the ball through the hoop and you'd be awarded like a ridiculous amount of points. And basically, you would almost guarantee victory if you could actually do this. How anyone managed to kick a rubber ball through this, the height of these things is quite high, is beyond me, but I guess it could be done. The ball game, people love the ball game. We think that people play it for fun. We think that there are professionals whose job it was just to play the ball game. We think that when Maya cities would sit down for diplomatic talks, one of the ways in which you showed you were friends with the neighboring people is that you played the kings would play the ball game. The other thing that they would do sometimes, just to show you the Maya have a sense of fun and sportiness, sometimes when they're trying to decide which of the two captives that they were going to sacrifice to their gods, they would put them in the ball game, and whoever lost then would be sacrificed at the end. Playing for high stakes. All right. The last of the three peoples that I'll talk about today from Mesoamerica are people, you could refer to them either as the Aztecs, which is the term that we more commonly know, or as the Mexica. And of course, this is where we get the modern day country, Mexico, the name. They refer to themselves as the Mexica, although in a weird way, Aztec also comes from one of their myths. It's a term that comes from one of their creation stories involved this sort of like cave-like place. It sounds very close to the term Aztec. Just to give you some idea, like what a rough and tumble culture the Aztecs were. This, by the way, is an earth god, a nature god. Nothing you'd want to run into in a dark alley. Trust me. The Aztec really, the reputation of the Aztec, even before they settled down in Mesoamerica, is one of terror. We think initially that this was a nomadic people who would go around sort of raining destruction, stealing things left and right, and stealing people at times. Often seizing all sorts of products that weren't nailed down, basically. And at least from what we can tell, from the Aztec appear to have been chased out of nearly every region they lived in, until finally they come to Mesoamerica. And they begin to settle down and begin to really create an empire that would essentially, in the end, bring almost all of Mesoamerica together in one governmental structure. So it's large. What's interesting to us about the Aztec is that after this career of being nomads, when they finally choose to settle down, they end up choosing a fantastic place for their purposes. This is an area that, in essence, is right near what today is Mexico City. The reason why they choose this region is simple. It is a swamp. And I know before, I will sell you on the swamp by the end. In fact, the Aztecs have good reason to want to live in the swamp, which is to say, it is suicidal for anyone to try to attack their home base because they were living in the swamp, and they knew it well. And that's one of the reasons why the swamp was actually great. They also they felt that the swamp gave them constant supply of food in the form of all sorts of things, creepy crawlies that basically live inside the swamp. They also discovered that if you go to the bottom of the swamps, you get like the muck at the bottom of the swamp. It is actually good fertilizer. So there was only positive as far as they were concerned with setting up shop in this area. We think that the Aztec end up becoming quite good at agriculture, although as we'll see later on, they don't tend to have the upper class doesn't actually have to get their hands dirty with farming at all, because they've conquered enough so they don't have to anymore. And in fact, really, even when they are settling down in this region, the Aztec make a very quick pivot to becoming conquerors. And slowly, by war, they begin to bring almost all of this region under their own sway. And really demand from it an absolutely huge amount of taxes. We think that this happens under the course of several different emperors. One of the ones that's at least most famous, this is an image, a modern image showing him, is a Cacao, if you like. This kind of goofier image from the Aztecs themselves of this famous emperor. His nickname was the Obsidian Serpent. Obsidian, you know already. This is basically knives to them, or swords. Serpent, because again, snake, of course, is associated with violence. And Ezacatl really has these conquests that really are associated with absolute violence, tearing into cities, slaughtering off the majority of inhabitants, enslaving those who didn't choose to kill off immediately, and then colonizing the regions. So there's this constant sort of move, basically, to conquer land and then put our own people in place for the most part. That's what they're doing for the most part. At the end of it, Ezacatl and the other emperors, sort of these campaigns of terror, what meant that the empire was quite large for a pre-modern empire. There's around 12 million people altogether under the sway of the Aztec. And inasmuch as there was anything like a government, the basic ideal of the Aztecs was to try to extract as much property from those people they had conquered as humanly possible. Really, we think the demands of the Aztecs were consistent and consistently high. Everything, crops, clothing, blankets, jewelry, anything that they wanted came from their subject people. And we don't think that the Aztec really never view themselves, this is something we've seen before in this class, the Aztec themselves as rulers never see themselves as people who bring government to anybody. They really, for the most part, they were completely hands-off rulers. If you, as local people, managed to produce what we asked for, we allowed you to live in peace. And this sense is so deep among the Aztec that although, they're really associated with being this warrior people, they don't even really bother to have a standing army. Because a standing army requires you to do things like, have some sort of very clear sort of taxation system and figure out how to, keep this army going. And it really was a lot more institutions than they wanted. So the Aztec would instead, whenever they needed to punish some of their subject peoples or try to take new lands, the emperor could stamp his feet and raise an army. And in fact, we think that Aztec men, because their identity is so tied together with military conquest, they were there to fight whenever necessary. And this made a lot of sense too, because there's not a huge amount of mobility in this society. You can't move much in your status. But when it came to war, this was actually one of the very few areas in which you could actually, if you really were very good at war, you had done well in conquest, you could actually, as a man, make a name for yourself and perhaps actually rise. So if you wanted to do that, war was really the only answer. Again, some of these wars, though, were different. Some of these were wars against fighting to bring new people to the empire. In other cases, you're just going around to subordinate people who didn't give enough money and just killing off a bunch of them. So there were very different kind of campaigns, and some of them were much bloodier than others. But the basic goal is very clear. The goal of this empire is to make sure people are kept in line. And if they are, and they keep giving their money, the Aztec leaders are perfectly happy. Much more so than any of the people we've seen so far, even more than the Maya, we have, as modern historians, much more information about Aztecs. And in fact, unlike the Maya, in which there was a much more systematic destruction of their books, we actually have some Aztec books that survive into the modern world. And on top of that, this is actually quite interesting. We're not going to talk much about this in this class, but when Western Europeans, and especially Spaniards, come to the New World, they actually will see the Aztec civilization still flourishing. They're going to bring an end to it. But before they do, they actually are able to see these people, talk with them, observe things in their society. So that's actually very helpful to us as well, trying to reconstruct what it was like. Some of the things that we've learned by these sources are things that perhaps do not surprise us much, is that, for instance, much like the Maya, we have a very clear hierarchy, very clear ladder where everyone is in the society. And unsurprisingly, the people at the top, by far, are the military elite. This is a society that really prizes war. And it really views basically all men are potential warriors. Usually speaking, I mean, this is a war is a game that especially the people who were nobles that had the best blood in society, you had to take part in. You couldn't just foist off battles on others. Nobles were expected to fight, and that was a part of the reason why they supposedly were given so much money and honor. So you had no choice. As I mentioned, though, too, depending upon the size of the campaign, they sometimes would involve much lower people in the social status. Always men, but they could fight as well. And we really think that the Aztec make a business of giving all sorts of things to successful warriors. They get the best land, they get the best food. If you eat meat in this society, your family is a military family. It goes to that. Luxury items like the cacao bean go almost exclusively to the military. And even walking around in the civilization, you'd immediately be able to see people who had served in military campaigns, because essentially, if you were a commoner, if you were a peasant, you would wear a burlap sack. That's basically what you would wear. If, however, you were a military man or military family, they would have these sort of bright colors. You would have all sorts of feathers from eagles and everything, and people lower on the scale could not wear those legally. So you would immediately be able to pick out who was a warrior and who was not. As for women, you're probably tired of me saying this at this point of the semester, but it's fair to say that women had no public role among the Aztecs. They do clearly have a lot of control when it comes to family life, but one of the few ways in which women could gain public honors was if you had given birth to one or many soldiers who proved to be very good at the battlefield. Part of that honor would end up actually reflecting upon the mother who gave birth to them and raised them as well. That's really the only sort of public honors a woman could receive. So it was really, to some degree, luck of the draw with women if your kids proved to be good fighters. But a principal function, as so many pre-modern societies, of women was to bear and raise children and to prepare food. In addition to just having a very strong military, we also think that the Aztec put a lot of energy into their priestly class. And in as much as anyone received education was the priests. They had to learn their very complicated calendar. They had to learn ritual, about which I'll talk more a little bit later on. Really, some of these rituals are just meant to make sure the gods smile on the Aztecs. In other cases, too, we think that part of the education of Aztec priests is to learn to read omens or oracles. This is what we see with other people. They felt by looking at nature in certain ways, you'd be able to figure out what was going to happen in the future. And often, priests actually end up serving as advisors to rulers. So they have quite a bit of influence in society. The bulk of this civilization, as in all in pre-modern world, were peasants who lived in these very interesting kind of organizations known as kalpuli. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that we don't think the Aztec government really cared at all to actually govern. But that left really a huge deal of problem if you were a peasant in the society, which is to say that the government really could care less about anything except that you were providing what you had to provide for them. And so that any of these sort of organizational tasks really devolved on the local level. Initially, Kalpuli are simply people who were involved, biologically involved with one another. But in time, it's simply going to mean people who live in the same region, basically the same village, are going to be part of the same group. These groups live in the same region. They have to work on their crops jointly. They really have to do basic things like, for instance, figure out who can do what farming, and what groups, what people in society were best for what task. Again, the repercussions if they didn't figure this out was that the government could come and destroy them because they weren't providing enough food for the Aztecs. But the other thing that the Kalpuli had to do in addition to just farming was that Aztec nobles also required peasants to sometimes work on the land of nobles. And again, these community groups basically had to figure out how to provide enough labor on a regular basis, including in some cases building all sorts of structures for the monuments. Let's skip ahead a little bit. The other thing that's always interested people in Aztec society has to do with their religious beliefs. And in some cases, the gods we know from the Aztecs are gods that we can actually identify from other places in Mesoamerica. I know this looks like an interesting sort of conglomeration. This is a Quetzalcoatl known as the feathered serpent, a very interesting kind of god that we see in Mesoamerica, who actually supports, on the one hand, arts and crafts and agriculture, and on top of that, also war. All these things are kind of like together in one god. And we do know, I should say, that the Aztecs do actually have a lot of respect for artisans and those who work with things like, for instance, exotic bird feathers or things like that. So this is something that was also part of the divine sphere as well. What horrifies people a little bit now, perhaps, is the attitude of people that I mentioned earlier was that Aztecs really felt that the world had come into being through sacrifice and was only sustained through bloodletting. That in fact, that if you wanted to continue getting agriculture, corn, and other crops, you had no choice but to do human sacrifice. And so we know one of the primary rituals that Aztec priests had to do was human sacrifice. And you can see here again, this priest has an obsidian knife and is slicing through someone's chest cavity, and the heart comes out at that point. And what really is surprising about Aztec sacrifice is not just that they cared, they did a lot of sacrifice. It was the industrial scale at which they did sacrifice. You get the idea that on some of their feast days, hundreds of people would be sacrificed as part of these rituals. Many of whom, again, are people who were taken captive in war. In some cases, people who were criminals. In other cases, believe it or not, there's supposedly people who've been volunteered for sacrifice. And we can see here, again, just to some degree, how really bloody in some sense. I mean, we really have discovered all sorts of hundreds of corpses from Aztec structures that show how many people were killed in one day. And we really do think, as I said, that it was felt that, especially the sun god, to show this sort of symbolism, if you were to battle against the stars and the moon and the night, you would need blood, more or less, to give him the energy to be able to do that. So even the very sun in the sky was based upon sacrifice, although much else was going to. All right, folks, we do the third quiz on Wednesday. Thank you.